Today we're going to talk about the top 8 UFC super fights that never happened and should have occurred at some point. Now there are some big glaring omissions that aren't going to be on the list, but it's only because I feel like people talk about those certain fights way too much. And it's not that they don't deserve to be talked about, because they clearly do, but I'll give you an example of a few of those. I mean, Khabib Nurmagomedov going up against Tony Ferguson, that's been talked about so much and been booked so many times, you know, in the past, and I just don't think it would be of the greatest service to talk about something that people have already discussed so many times, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's MMA podcasts, whether it's ESPN MMA. I mean, I just feel like it's not necessary to talk about that because it's been covered so many times. And then another fight would be Jon Jones going up against Francis Ngannou, with Ngannou being out of the UFC and most likely looking to pursue professional boxing. I would like to talk about that a little bit, but I kind of already touched on that in the Jon Jones return video a few months before he made his return at UFC 285 on my channel. You can find it. I can probably put a link to it in the description of this video, but these are fights that, yes, are very popular. Yes, you have heard about them, but some of them I feel like haven't been talked about as much as they should have. So this is going to be the top 8 UFC super fights that never happened. We're going to kick off the list with a battle in the UFC's bantamweight division between two fighters, and one fighter who wasn't even a bantamweight at the time and was still competing at 145 pounds. That man, of course, is Frankie the Answer Edgar going up against the who would have been reigning defending bantamweight champion at the time in Dominic the Dominator Cruz. Dominic Cruz versus Frankie Edgar, in their heyday and in their prime of their mixed martial arts career, was going to be one of the best fights that we could have ever seen in that bantamweight division, because you had a man in Dominic Cruz who brought a creative and elusive footwork style unlike anybody else in mixed martial arts. And he was kind of the founding father of footwork in high-level mixed martial arts competition, and then it would be adapted and evolved by fighters like TJ Dillashaw and Corey Sandhagen, one of which is on the list a little bit further down the line. But I feel like the boxing, footwork-heavy style of Frankie Edgar, paired with the speedy punching combinations and his ability to use his lateral movement and in-and-out footwork to dance around his opponents, would give Dominic Cruz a unique challenge that at the time he had never seen before in his career. The closest challenge to a Frankie Edgar would have been a TJ Dillashaw, even though I feel like Dillashaw had more deadly finishing power on the feet than the Answer ever had. But it would have been interesting to see if the Answer was just that, the answer to the Dominator in Dominic Cruz, and could have been the man to fully take him off the mantle of the bantamweight GOAT, who many people believed he still is, including myself. But I love the idea of a Frankie Edgar and Dominic Cruz fight in their heyday. I even liked the idea of Frankie Edgar versus Dominic Cruz a couple years back, but we never got to see it. And I think if I was going to look at it now, looking at each fighter in their prime, I think the footwork of Dominic Cruz would give Frankie Edgar a lot of trouble, but I think the championship rounds would be a very big test for Dominic against a fighter who had the cardio, forward pressure, volume, attrition, and determination like Edgar had. This is a fight that I'm very sad we never got, and it's going to be the first entry on our list. Jose Aldo versus Anthony Showtime Pettis for the lightweight championship was set to take place at UFC 163 in August of 2013. However, it never came to fruition, and I believe it was due to the fact that Anthony Pettis suffered an injury, and that is why the Korean zombie Chan Sung Jung got a crack at the title against Jose Aldo Jr. at 145 pounds. But Aldo was set to make the move up to 155 pounds and challenge for a second belt, which would have made him the first fighter in UFC history to challenge for a second belt, trying to become a double champion at the time. It was a huge deal. But unfortunately, an injury to Anthony Showtime Pettis would put a halt to the bout, and we would never get the chance to see it inside the octagon. Pettis still had his aura of invincibility at this point, and if he was to go up against Jose Aldo, it would be the flashy, traditional martial arts and taekwondo heavy kicking style of Anthony Pettis versus the beautiful Thai style kickboxing of Jose Aldo. Would the taekwondo style kicks, the spinning kicks, tornado kicks, jumping roundhouse kicks off the cage, and sneaky jiu-jitsu of Anthony Pettis be able to catch Aldo and cause him to retain the title? Or would Aldo's speed, technical kickboxing, beautiful takedown defense, and overall cleaner technique as a full-on mixed martial artist be way too much for Anthony Pettis to handle? If I had to go back and break it down at the time and look at the fighter's skill set at the time that the fight was originally set to take place, I think Aldo would have absolutely ran through Pettis. But I think Pettis would have had some glimmers of hope and the unorthodox and flashy style of Showtime would have caused Aldo some trouble at certain points of the fight. I think you would have to look out for the spinning wheel kicks, the spinning kicks to the body, and potentially even Showtime kicks or knees off the cage. But when it all was said and done, if the fight did take place, I think Aldo would have dominated for the majority of the fight, either getting a late finish by working the low kicks and the body shots, or winning a very convincing unanimous decision. But Aldo versus Pettis, Showtime versus Junior, is another fight that I wish MMA fans could have seen. Anthony "Rumble" Johnson versus Jon Jones for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship was a fight that was supposed to take place, and I really wish it would have. It would be the technical and overall complete mixed martial arts game of Jon Bones Jones that he was even able to showcase in the heavyweight division after winning the heavyweight championship by defeating Cyril Gane via first-round submission at UFC 285, going up against the one-punch, skull-crushing, obliterative power of Anthony "Rumble" Johnson. Would Rumble be able to close the gap and land a big shot on Jon Jones and knock him out? Or would Jon Jones be able to dance around the octagon using side kicks and front kicks to the knee, showcasing his elite level of distance control, and then pairing that with beautiful clinch work, wrestling, and top control, even with his submission game that we've already touched on? This was a fight that I think every fan wanted to see, and we're very sad that we're never going to get the chance to see it, ever, because of the passing of Anthony "Rumble" Johnson. Rest in peace to Anthony "Rumble" Johnson, one of the legends of the sport. But going back to breaking down the fight from a technical standpoint, it would kind of be the original version of a Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou fight that every fan in this day and age wants to see. Would it be the one-punch power of Anthony "Rumble" Johnson being able to crash the pocket and put Jones out cold? Or would Jones be able to keep Johnson at bay, picking him apart until he was able to sap the gas tank and eventually finish him later on in the fight? I don't know, but either way, Jon Jones versus Anthony "Rumble" Johnson had no choice but to make the list. Up next, we're going to talk about a fight that was originally set to headline Madison Square Garden at UFC 230 between Dustin "The Diamond" Poirier and Nate Diaz. The Stockton Gangster versus the Diamond was a fight that fans all around the world didn't know they wanted until it was announced for the main event of MSG. But after Conor McGregor's loss to Nate Diaz and the stardom that Nate Diaz was able to find with the promo he cut after the victory over Michael Johnson, and then the short notice victory over Conor McGregor, and the razor-thin fan favorite rematch that took place at UFC 202, paired with the rise to stardom of the Diamond and Dustin Poirier, who was on the brink of a lightweight title shot, this fight was fan favorite, this fight was a barn burner, and this fight was exactly that, a fight from bell to bell. However, after contractual disputes and a hip injury to Dustin Poirier, the fight wouldn't come to fruition, and the main event of UFC 230 would go on to be a heavyweight championship bout between the Black Beast Derek Lewis and the heavyweight champion at the time in Daniel D.C. Cormier. But Poirier versus Diaz is a fight that even makes sense now. Although Dustin Poirier was able to get interim lightweight gold after defeating Max Holloway at UFC 236, he was never able to capture undisputed gold. But he could challenge Nate Diaz for a second iteration of the BMF Championship at any point in his career, and fans would tune in from start to finish. It would be the heavy volume and championship round pace of Nate Diaz versus the multiple shot boxing combination, stance changing and angle shifts of Dustin Poirier, paired with the one punch knockout power that he showcased throughout his career, most recently in a knockout victory over Conor McGregor in the rematch at UFC 257, and then a leg break TKO victory in the trilogy bout at UFC 264 in International Fight Week. But Dustin Poirier had the power and has the power to put Nate Diaz out. But nobody has ever been able to finish the iron chin known as Nate Diaz, except for Josh the Punk Thompson. So with Diaz's pace, pressure, attrition, and long-rangey boxing combinations give Dustin Poirier trouble and stop him from being able to close the distance. I honestly feel like I would be leaning towards Nate Diaz at this point in both of their careers, and that's crazy due to the level of activity that Dustin Poirier has had, even coming up with wins recently over Iron Michael Chandler, and a fight where he almost finished Charles Oliveira to win the UFC Lightweight Championship. And then pairing that with the two victories over Conor McGregor after originally losing to McGregor at UFC 178, I feel like some fans may think I'm crazy for saying that, but Nate Diaz came off that submission victory over Tony Ferguson at UFC 279 in the short notice main event bout where he was originally set to take on Khamzat Chimaev, and he was the first man to ever submit Tony Ferguson. And I think that if there's one man that could upset the masses and prove everybody wrong again, it's the master of proving people wrong, and the master of the Stockton slap, and the king of the 209 in Nate Diaz. But I hope at some point we do get the chance to see the Diamond versus the Stockton Gangster, and there's no way that I couldn't put Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier from UFC 230 on the list. TJ Dillashaw versus Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson had the chance to be one of the greatest mixed martial arts fights of the new era of the sport. However, after a series of unfortunate events, the fight would not be able to take place. Both Dillashaw and Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson would compete on the Sacramento card known as UFC 227. In the main event, TJ Dillashaw would defend his newly won UFC Bantamweight Championship successfully against Cody No Love Garbrandt, knocking him out for the second time. However, Johnson, who competed in a rematch of his own on that card against Henry Cejudo, who he dispatched of in the first fight early on in the first round, didn't have the same success. And it would be a massive upset where Henry Cejudo would defeat the then champion, and who many people believe to be the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the sport, in Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson via decision to become the new UFC flyweight champion. Following this loss, Mighty Mouse would actually be traded over to ONE Championship in exchange for the undefeated fighter known as Ben Askren. However, Dillashaw would continue his aspirations to drop down to 125 pounds, doing it scientifically and challenging the new champion in Henry Cejudo for the flyweight championship on the first UFC event on ESPN. However, it was an unsuccessful title chase after Dillashaw would be dispatched of in the first round via TKO, and then Henry Cejudo, after defending the title successfully, would go on to UFC 238 to become the double champion, thus donning himself Triple C by defeating Magic Marlon Moraes to claim the vacant UFC Bantamweight Championship after Dillashaw vacated it due to testing positive for erythropoietin, or EPO. And this was a gigantic missed opportunity for the UFC because I feel like Dillashaw versus Johnson, like I said, had the chance to be one of the best fights of the new era of mixed martial arts. Would the footwork, level changes, and elite wrestling of TJ Dillashaw be too much for Mighty Mouse to decode? Or would the speed, technical ability, and well-rounded and polished mixed martial arts game of Mighty Mouse be enough to catch Dillashaw in his trap? I have no idea, and this is one fight that irks me every single day that we didn't get the chance to see it. Maybe down the line, if a series of unfortunate, or in this time fortunate events seems to occur, but Dillashaw versus Mighty Mouse had to make the list. The last Emperor versus the next big thing. Fedor Emelianenko versus Brock Lesnar, which would claim the first UFC fight for Fedor Emelianenko's UFC career. However, it never occurred. There was an opportunity that Dana White said he was very close to signing the last Emperor to a UFC contract. And from 2008 to around 2011, that was the only thing that UFC and mixed martial arts fans around the world could think of. Before the Khabib Nurmagomedovs and Islam Makhachevs, the pride of Russia was the last Emperor. He had remained undefeated for over a decade in his mixed martial arts career, until Fabricio Verdum was able to catch him in a triangle choke and advance in the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix, handing Fedor Emelianenko, like I said, his first loss in professional mixed martial arts in over a decade. Fedor and Lesnar would both go on a downward spiral in their mixed martial arts careers from around 2010 through 2012, even though Lesnar's mixed martial arts career ended in 2011, or at least the high-level UFC career would be put on hold in that year. And there's a really sour taste in a lot of the fans' mouth considering we never got the chance to see Lesnar versus Emelianenko. Would the one-punch knockout power and solid takedown defense of the last Emperor be enough to put Brock Lesnar out cold on the feet? Or would the high-level NCAA wrestling of Lesnar be able to ground Fedor Emelianenko and ground and pound him into oblivion for a potential TKO or a potential submission attempt like he was able to catch Shane Carwin in? This was one of the first dream fights that the UFC fans and mixed martial arts fans around the world had continued to ponder once the UFC reached its level of mainstream stardom. If I was going to make a prediction, I would say that the striking of Fedor Emelianenko would be too much for Brock Lesnar and he would be dispatched of early in round 1. And we're talking about prime versus prime. Prime Lesnar and prime Emelianenko. If the fight was to take place at this point in time, I think Lesnar would be able to take down Fedor early and ground and pound him for a first round TKO. But prime versus prime, I think the one-hitter-quitter power of Emelianenko and the stellar takedown defense he was able to showcase for the majority of his mixed martial arts career would be too much for the next big thing, and the last Emperor would be able to dispatch of Lesnar in round 1 and claim his first UFC victory, a thing we never got to see. But there's no chance that the last Emperor versus the next big thing couldn't make the list of UFC super fights that never happened. GSP versus Khabib is a fight that to this day fans continue to question. Would the undefeated Nurmagomedov be able to take down and control GSP just like all of his other opponents? Or would GSP's stellar takedown defense, in-and-out footwork, and stellar jab be able to keep Khabib at bay and pick him apart on the feet? These are two of the most asked questions between casual and hardcore mixed martial arts fans. Would Khabib be able to take down GSP and control him just like all of his other opponents? Or would GSP be able to showcase his stellar striking and his overall well-rounded complete toolbox of mixed martial arts skills in his entire game? I feel like if I was going to break it down at this point, if the fight was to take place at 155 pounds where GSP believed he could make the weight and continued to be adamant that he could make the weight after coming back and moving up to 185 pounds and challenging Michael Bisping after 4 years away from the sport and winning the title via a rear naked choke submission after dropping Michael Bisping with a left hook, landing beautiful elbows from ground and pound on the top, and then sinking in one of the tightest and cleanest rear naked chokes I've ever seen in mixed martial arts in the second UFC event at MSG. However, let's get back to what we were originally talking about before I went on that little tangent. If the fight was to take place in the UFC's lightweight division, even if GSP made the weight successfully and did so under healthy conditions, I still feel like it would be the Eagles' fight to lose. The top control, the pressure, the forward pressure, and just the overall strength of Khabib on the floor, competing against a depleted GSP where even if he made the weight successfully and did it scientifically like Dillashaw dropping to 125, it would be a depleted version of Rush, and he would get controlled by Khabib. He would get controlled, he would get taken down, he would get grounded and pounded, and potentially even finished by the Eagle. However, if the fight took place at 170 pounds in the welterweight division and Khabib would move up in weight and GSP can make that weight healthily and also make that weight under the conditions where he won his UFC welterweight championship, I feel like the fight would be a lot more competitive and close on all aspects of the game of mixed martial arts. And the fact that GSP had some sneaky good wrestling, considering he didn't come up as a high school or college wrestler, was one of the most impressive things about Rush's entire game. He had one of the best blast double leg takedowns in the entire history of the sport. And considering he didn't come up from a wrestling background, like I already stated, it makes it that much more impressive. Now Khabib was going to be stronger. He would be stronger even at 170 pounds with the grappling and top pressure that he has. However, I feel like GSP's striking, speed, and cardio would give Khabib a lot of trouble in not only finding the successful range he needs to execute his game plan, but in getting caught with multiple punches and kicking combinations as he tried to close that distance. Even the spinning back kick to the body that GSP learned from one of the best martial artists who wasn't a UFC fighter in Joe Rogan. I love the idea of a GSP versus Khabib fight. It's a fight that fans talk about all the time. It's a fight that fans all around the world wanted to see. But if it was prime versus prime, at 155 pounds I have to go with the Eagle. But if it took place at 170 pounds, I think Rush would add another name to his mixed martial arts Mount Rushmore and continue to be the greatest of all time, or in other words, the GOAT of MMA. For our final entry into the list of super fights that never occurred, did you really think we forgot about this one? I know we're going back to back on GSP potential fights, but we have to include this without a doubt. Rush versus the Spider, Anderson Silva versus George St. Pierre, is one of the most questioned fights in the history of fantasy MMA matchmaking. At the time that the fight was originally rumored, GSP was the kingpin at 170 pounds in the welterweight division, racking up title defenses like some people rack up coupons for the Kroger on a Saturday morning. And Anderson Silva was killing off everybody in the middleweight division with front kicks, spinning elbows, roundhouse kicks, shots to the body, and triangle chokes off of his back against gangsters, or in his case, American gangsters. GSP versus Anderson Silva was two of the greatest mixed martial artists of all time going up against each other. It would be one of the first times we could see the pound for pound going up against the pound for pound. Now, we most recently saw the new era version of this when Islam Makhachev battled Alexander Volkanovski, with the featherweight champion going up to try to claim lightweight gold at UFC 284 in Melbourne, Australia. However, this is different. This is a clash of the champions on every level of the game. Would GSP's stellar jab and unbelievable wrestling be able to control the Spider just like Chael Sonnen did in their first fight at UFC 117 before he was submitted in the final round of the championship bout? Or would Anderson Silva be able to fend off the wrestling of St. Pierre, keep him at a distance, use his elite level fakes and feints and head movement, and hypnotize GSP before sniping him with a kill shot? GSP versus Anderson Silva is one of the greatest mixed martial arts fights that never occurred. It is the first proposed mixed martial arts super fight. And if it was to take place while both men were still in their prime, I would lean ever so slightly towards GSP being able to instill the wrestling game plan and not being finished like Chael Sonnen was, but I could just as easily see Anderson Silva causing GSP to freeze at a certain point, and freeze long enough to get caught with a big shot and put away. But that was the first time we could have seen the true kingpin of mixed martial arts, with two of the greatest pound-for-pound mixed martial artists battling each other to see who was the greatest in the history of the sport. GSP versus Anderson Silva is everything you could ask for in a potential super fight. It was one of the biggest super fights that had ever been proposed or thought about in the history of the sport. And GSP versus Anderson Silva was the true Super Bowl of mixed martial arts.